Good. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Chebeague Island Historical Society's Ellsworth Miller Memorial Lecture Series, established by Cap Leonard. The Historical Society sincerely thanks Cap for his continued support of this lecture series. Those who wish to help support the efforts of the Historical Society can donate online at shebeaguehistory.com. And before starting this lecture, we want to acknowledge the indigenous people who were the first to inhabit Chebeague, forage its fields and forests, and fish its waters. And then questions about the lecture will be addressed following the lecture. And please type these questions in the chat box and select to everyone. And then after the meeting, I will bring them to Earle's attention. So without further ado, I'm going to push a few buttons and then turn the, here we go, turn the lecture over to Earle. There we go.
Great. Let's see, John. I'm just thinking here, do we go to a full screen with me? Because I'm seeing all of the other boxes right now.
I think it'll switch once we go to the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay, fine. No, that'll be fine.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, once again, it's a pleasure to be with members of the Chebeague Island Historical Society. This evening, we're going to be talking about postcard history of Portland. To get back in time a little bit for background, I'd like to start right after the Civil War with the concept of the 1 penny postcard that was issued by the U.S. government around 1870. And this is the same postcard where you put an address on the front and a message on the back that is still available, although not nearly as much used as it was in the 19th and into the 20th century. But this was the first form of postcard, and it was an official government issue, an official government publication. Uh, the first time that a postcard emerged as a pictorial element was at the time of the Great World's Fair in Chicago in 1892-93. Someone in the Postal Service got the bright idea that it would be popular to create postcards that showed different buildings at the World's Fair on one side and then address on the other. And it really took off. It became very popular at the fair as well as elsewhere in the country. And so in 1898, the U.S. government passed the Private Mailing Act. Now, it was fairly restrictive for commercial enterprises to create postcards outside of the government, in that these postcards would have a pictorial image on one side and an address on the other, but naively, no place for a message, because these were a penny postcard, and you really were not supposed to be doing maybe more than just signifying to the sender where it was coming from. Well, of course, people rebelled against this, and from 1898 until 1907, they actually wrote messages on the fronts of the cards, oftentimes on the images themselves, and sometimes creative postcard makers would leave some white space for people to scribble a little note on. In 1907, the Congress recognized that this was all not realistic, and they created the modern day postcard with the image on one side, the message to the left, and the address to the right. And that is, of course, what we still have after more than 100 years. In terms of Portland, Portland by the late 19th, early 20th century was a major tourist destination. During the summer, there were approximately 250,000 people visiting Portland, both the city and also the islands. So the postcard manufacturers recognized that Portland was a major hub and an excellent place to make postcards of for these large numbers of tourists, as well as local people as well. There were two local companies, the Leighton Company and the Morris Company, and they made large numbers of Portland and Maine postcards, also beyond Maine as well. Their postcards were a little bit different than the cards we're going to be seeing this evening, in that they were based upon photographs, as are the cards that we'll see this evening, often taken by very good professional photographers. But they were then these photographs were then sent to Germany, at least prior to World War One, in order to be turned into color lithographs for the images. The Germans were very adept at color. They had been since the 19th century, color printing, and our companies here in Portland would send their photographs to Germany and have the cards processed there. The difference in what we'll see tonight are that we're going to look almost exclusively at a higher grade of postcard, beautiful kind of postcard that was produced by a U.S. firm called the Detroit Publishing Company. They hired very fine photographers, and they had bought a Swiss color printing process called phototint, which allowed them to manufacture their cards in America and to manufacture cards that had unusually fine qualities of color, so that many of these cards will actually almost look like period watercolors. Nonetheless, the Detroit cards of the Portland area produced a very important record of what the city was like in the late 19th and early 20th century. The Detroit Company continued in business into the 1920s, although most of the cards that we'll see tonight range from around maybe 1900 to about 1915. So let's switch over now to the first image. Thank you. Um, so this is actually the one card of the evening that is not a Detroit card, but I thought it would be fun to show you greetings from Portland, Maine. This is one of the cards made by one of the local companies. And as you can see, the red print that says Portland in that banneret, that could be switched out for almost any place in Maine. It was a very sort of handy all-purpose card with the Maine seal at the upper right, but it's a way of starting out with greetings from Portland. Next, please. This, I should amend my comments. This is also a non-Detroit card, but I just wanted to use it to set the scene. Here we're looking at an adaptation from 1903 of the great view of Portland and the harbor in 1855 from what was then Cape Elizabeth, now South Portland. The vessel on the in the launching area in the center of the image is from the Dyer shipyard in Cape Elizabeth, which was one of the big shipyards in the mid-19th century. And so here we have Portland, the peninsula, kind of wonderful horizontal view of it, with Munjoy Hill at the right and the Western Promenade at the left. And this, of course, was the thriving city of the pre-Civil War period, only to be destroyed by the Great Fire in 1866 and then rebuilt very quickly thereafter into a largely new city, which by the late 19th century was a major tourist attraction. Next, please. Now we're into the Detroit views, and we're looking here at a lovely photograph of the old wharves on the waterfront, bearing in mind that Commercial Street was created around 1850, the early 1850s, and the wharves extended out from Commercial Street at that time. And so by the early 1900s, many of the wharf structures were a little bit weather beaten, a little bit the worse for wear, and we also see vessels at the mouth of the wharf from the very large and active fishing fleet of Portland. Next, please. Of course, what consideration of Portland would be complete without Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Longfellow was born in Portland in 1807. We'll see in a moment his birthplace, and then, of course, the home that he grew up in, the famous Longfellow House. Longfellow, as I say, grew up in Portland, attended Bowdoin College. Early in his life, after Bowdoin, he studied Romance languages in Europe, and then came back, taught at Bowdoin, then taught at Harvard, but all the time in the 1830s, 40s, into the 1850s, was building his reputation as a great poet. And by the 1850s, he was really not only in America, but also in the English-speaking world, one of the major poets of the 19th century. He lived in Cambridge from 1843 in the Craigie House until his death in 1882. But every year, usually in the summer, he would return to Portland to visit his old home and his sister, Anne Longfellow Pierce. Next, please. This is the house at the corner of 4 and Hancock Streets on the old waterfront where Longfellow was born. It was called the Stevenson House, and the Stevensons were in-laws of the Longfellows, and this was a very handsome 3-story hip-roofed federal house on 4th Street. It happened that that the Longfellows were staying with the Stevensons when Longfellow the poet was born, and it was only a matter of a few months before Stephen and Zilpha and their emerging family, including Henry, moved to the brick house on Congress Street. This house survived until 1955. In 1914, it was acquired by a group called the International Longfellow Society, and a very colorful fellow named Arthur Charles Jackson ran this organization, which opened the house as a museum. It really reflects the cult of Longfellow, the fact that there was so much interest in Longfellow into the 20th century that his birthplace, where he literally was born and then carried a few months later to Congress Street, would become a historic house museum. But alas, when Jackson died in 1949, the organization basically fell apart, dismantled, and the house was torn down in 1955. Next, please. Here is the Wadsworth Longfellow House on Congress Street, which is still very much with us today. The house was originally built as a 2.5-story brick house, the first entirely brick structure on the Portland Peninsula, in 1785-86 by the poet's grandfather, General Peleg Wadsworth, who had returned to Portland after the Revolution and decided to settle here, raise his family here. The house was completed in 1786, and where you see the entrance to the Maine Historical Society was a simple 2-story wooden structure that General Wadsworth had as a store. And although General Wadsworth was a merchant, he was also a politician, and he served in early U.S. Congresses representing a section of the District of Maine while we were still part of Massachusetts. In 1807 or 1808, General Wadsworth left this house to reside in a new home that he had built in Hiram in western Maine. He had acquired land as a bounty for his service in the Revolution, and he built a large frame house there called Wadsworth Hall that is still in the Wadsworth family today. It's really quite a remarkable house in its own right. And so at that point, he turned the brick house over to his daughter Zilpha and her husband Stephen, and this is when they began to live here and raise their family here. In 1814, there was a roof fire, which meant that the roof needed to be replaced, And at that time, Stephen decided to raise the house to 3 stories and give it a low hip-roofed federal appearance. This house remained in the family until the death of Anne Longfellow Pierce, the poet's sister, in 1901. She willed it to the Maine Historical Society with the understanding the society would build its library on the premises, which they did in 1907, and you see that to the right. Next, please. The Wadsworth Longfellow House was the first historic house museum to open in Maine. A year before, the old York Jail had opened as a historic building museum. And here we have the entrance hall, which has the 18th century staircase intact. Interestingly, the wallpaper that you see in this early 1900s view, postcard view, is actually the wallpaper that was restored in recent years by the Maine Historical Society. This was, I guess, the third wallpaper on the hall was put there by Anne Longfellow Pierce when she took over the house in the mid-19th century after the death of her parents. Next, please. This is the parlor that you see to the left of the hall, and it's in a decor of the early 20th century. The wallpaper here is pretty lively, and it's kind of a floral arts and crafts wallpaper, not one of the Longfellow period, but one that the Society placed there in the early 1900s. It's since been replaced by a more authentic wallpaper. We already see in the parlor the richness and the importance of this house, not only for its association with Longfellow, but also the fact that it is a 3-generation home with antiquities, with furnishings that go back into the 18th century and continue on into the Victorian period. 3 generations or more of possessions. Next, please. If you are standing in the hallway, instead of going left, you go right. You enter this additional front room on the right of the house. And this originally was a dining room. And it then was evolved into Stephen Longfellow's law office. In fact, that great piece of furniture to the left in the alcove was originally a sideboard. And then when Stephen turned this room into a law office, the bookcase was added on the top. And then after Stephen's time in Anne's period of living in the house for about 50 years, she used this as her family parlor. And her portrait in this early 20th century view is over the mantelpiece. Next, please. This is the famous rainy day room, which is a small room at the back of the house. This is the room where the poet wrote the famous Rainy Day poem in 1843 at this desk. And of course, the Victorians loved relics. And if you look over the fireplace in this early view, you will see a Harrison Brown painting of Presumscot River, but above it is a section of a vine that grew in the yard at the time of the Rainy Day poem. And it's sort of a sacred relic that was put on view. Also, all through the house, there were these interpretive signs, such as the one tacked on the door at the center right. Next, please. Probably the most lively room in this early museum house was the kitchen, in which virtually every element, every utensil that Anne would have used in her lifetime was brought out on display. And almost as though not to let these get away, there was the construction of this sort of fence-like feature in the front. This was and the big sign over the mantelpiece says the old kitchen. I had a wonderful professor and mentor at Boston University in graduate school, Abbott Lowell Cummings, who headed what is now Historic New England. And he used to call early displays like this in historic house museums of the turn of the century the culinary obstacle course. Today, the Society interprets this in a little more restrained manner. Next, please. Here is one of the upstairs bedrooms. Next, please. And this is the poet's room on the third floor. This is the room that he stayed in whenever he returned to the house. His last visit was in the summer of 1881. He died in March of 1882. Next, please. One of the great landmarks of the federal period of the early 19th century, when Portland was the thriving maritime metropolis, it was, and fortunately still is, the Portland Observatory on Munjoy Hill. This very unusual signal tower, octagonal in form, rises 82 feet above Munjoy Hill. It was the brainchild of Captain Lemuel Moody, who served in his youth in the army in the Revolution. He became a mariner, and he realized that there was a need for a signal tower so that when merchants' ships were coming into the harbor, they could fly their insignia flag, and then the observatory would have a whole set of those flags. They'd fly the merchant's flag. The folks on the wharf could see that a vessel was coming in, and they could ready the wharves for its coming. The observatory continued after Moody's death in 1846 into the 20th century. It was inherited by his heirs, who became the York family. They gave it to the city of Portland in 1939. It was initially restored during the WPA period, and then more recently, the city and Greater Portland Landmarks made a major effort to re-restore the observatory. It continues to be open during the summer as a joint effort of the city and Landmarks. It is the only signal tower of its kind left on the Atlantic coast, and it is a National Historic Landmark. Next, please. Now, just below the observatory on Congress Street is the ancient Eastern Cemetery. The Eastern Cemetery, historians believe, goes back to the earliest period of settlement on the peninsula. The earliest burials recorded are from the 1660s, although the earliest stones are not until about 1720. One of the focal points of the Eastern Cemetery are these three cenotaphs above ground. These mark the graves of the two young captains, the British captain, the American captain, who were killed in the Battle of the Boxer and the Enterprise off the mouth of the Kennebec River in 1813, the fall of 1813, during the War of 1812. The American vessel Enterprise was victorious and brought the Boxer into Portland Harbor as a prize, but it was a fearful toll because both of these young men in their 20s were killed in battle. And then the final grave marks a lieutenant a British lieutenant who was badly wounded, but who lived for a number of months in the care of the young men of Portland. And then there was a public subscription to mark these graves, and it's very symbolic that both the young captains and the lieutenant were all buried together side by side. And this is referenced in Longfellow's great poem, My Lost Youth. Next, please. On the opposite side of the city is the old Western Cemetery, with this series of tombs built into the side of the hill above which is Bowden Street. The Eastern Cemetery rapidly filled up by the 1820s, although there still continued to be some burials in through the 19th century. But the city decided that a new cemetery on the west end, which was then largely undeveloped, would be appropriate. And so in 1829, the Western Cemetery was established. It lasted into the late 19th century, but in the meantime, much larger suburban cemeteries, Evergreen and Forest, were created by the city. Next, please. In terms of historic houses in Portland, of course, there were and still are a great many. And this Detroit postcard commemorates the home of a notable 19th century figure, General Neal Dow, who we see in the upper right-hand corner in the vignette. Uh, the Neal Dow House was built in 1829 when Dow was a young man. He worked initially with his father in the tannery business. The house became his lifelong home for his wife and his family. And he died in 1897. It was then inherited by two more generations before, in the 1970s, it became the property of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This leads us to the fact that General Dow, beginning in the mid-19th century, became one of the most renowned American reformers for temperance. He was very influential in state temperance laws, particularly in Maine. The Maine law was one of the first prohibition laws in the country, and he campaigned all over the United States as well as in England and Europe, even ran for president in the late 19th century on the prohibition ticket. But of course, we know that by 1933, a prohibition was repealed nationally, and we live in a rather different time from what Neal Dow might have envisioned. Next, please. Another of these commemorative postcards for a famous Portland person, and in this case, their birthplace, was the home of Thomas B. Reed that was just a few feet away from Longfellow's birthplace here on Hancock Street. Interesting circa 1800 double federal house where Reed was born. He's shown in the upper left-hand corner. Thomas B. Reed was born here in 1839, attended Bowdoin. He graduated in 1860, served in the U.S. Navy during the Civil War, and then after the war, quickly got into state and national politics. And from the 1870s through the 1890s, he represented the Portland area and southern Maine in the U.S. Congress. He became, in the 1880s and 90s, one of the most powerful politicians in America. He was a Republican, as of course were many politicians in the post-Civil War period, and he ascended to the speakership of the U.S. House of Representatives. He was known as Czar Reed because he controlled the House with an iron fist, and he created a whole new set of rules called Reed's Rules of Order for the House. Many of those are still used today, and he made a very important impact on the politics of his time. In fact, I read a book fairly recently by the U.S. House historian, which ranks Reed as one of the three most influential speakers of the House in its history. Reed was a very principled man, and in 1898, when we entered the Spanish-American War, he did not believe that America should be involved in what he thought was imperialism, getting involved in the Caribbean and in the Pacific with the Philippines as well as Cuba. And so at the height of his power, he resigned his speakership and went into private practice as a lawyer. He died in 1902. Next, please. Here is one of Portland's signature landmarks, the Union Station on St. John Street, built in 1888 by the Maine Central Railroad in a time when travel by rail was the predominant means of travel in Maine. When this station was built, it's maybe hard to believe, but in a 24-hour period, there were as many as 80 different trains passing through this station. It was a symbol of the success of the railroads. There were, of course, many railroad stations in Maine built by the Maine Central Road and other railroads, but none was more grand than this stone French chateau-esque style building. And it was greatly beloved for generations until shockingly, it was torn down in 1961 after the passenger service was phased out by the railroad, sold to a developer for a strip mall. And its loss was really the factor that ignited the preservation movement in Portland and ultimately in Maine. For a year later, Mrs. Kenneth C.M. Sills created the Sills Committee, which in 1964 became Greater Portland Landmarks. And even today, in discussions of preservation issues, the ghost of Union Station is evoked. Next, please. This is a slightly later card, but a Detroit card showing the expansion of Union Station. A section to the right was added for an additional baggage room in 1906. Next, please. And here is the dining room. This was run by the Armstrong Company. They did railroad dining rooms. So if you were waiting for a train for some time, this was a nice place to resort to. Next, please. And the opportunity to get fruit and candy and newspapers. This was the newspaper stand right on the platform at Union Station. Next, please. Now, across the city, because of course Union Station was at the west end of the peninsula, was another great railroad station, the Grand Trunk Station at the corner of 4 and India Streets. The Grand Trunk Railway was started as the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railway in 1845, and it finally opened between Montreal and Portland in 1853. It was a vital economic link between Portland and Canada for generations. What would occur, products would be shipped from Canada by the rail and then shipped out to England and Europe from docks, the Grand Trunk docks that were just behind where this station was. And you can see in the background to the left and right the great grain elevators built in the 1890s to store the Canadian grain before it was shipped to England and to Europe. This station replaced an earlier station that had been built in the 1850s, and it, I think, very much aspired to be sort of the Union Station of the East End with its great clock tower, its beautiful tiled roof, its stonework, and its turreted style. It was a handsome building. It outlived the Union Station by only 5 years. It was torn down in 1966, and there is a rather ignominious pumping station there now at the corner of 4 in India. Next, please. Now, with all of these tourists, these visitors coming to Portland at the turn of the century meant a boom in hotel building. And the Rhines family were really the preeminent hotel builders. This is the old Congress Square Hotel. It's still standing and now used for housing, but was one of the great hotels, corner of Congress and Forest Avenues, built in the 1890s, designed by Francis Fassett and his son, Edward. Next, please. And here is the hotel just a few years after that first postcard. And you can see down on Forest Avenue at the right, the prosperity of this establishment is such that a whole new wing was added to the right on the back of the building. And that's still there today. Next, please. These hotels were very elegant places. This is the top floor dining room of the Congress Square Hotel. Terrazzo floors, marble columns, stained glass windows, and great views out to the city and the harbor. Next, please. And this is the view from the Congress Square dining room, looking out over Spring Street into the harbor and South Portland and Cape Elizabeth beyond. Next, please. Another of the great hotels, which like the Congress Square has been converted in recent years into housing, is the Lafayette Hotel, built in 1903. The name comes from the fact that when the Marquis de Lafayette visited Portland in the mid-1820s, there was a boarding house here at which he was entertained. Next, please. Portland has a series of great monuments, and these were commemorated in Detroit postcards. One of the first of these to be erected was to the poet Longfellow. As I mentioned, he had died in 1882. He, by that time, had a worldwide reputation. In fact, I always love the story in Queen Victoria's diary when Longfellow came to call on her at Windsor. She wrote that evening of his visit, "Never were my servants more excited by a visitor, and never more did they try to clamor to see him." Um, so in any case, not long after his death, there was a movement to create a monument. And this was artistically a joint effort of two very important Portland-related artistic figures. The very handsome granite base was designed by Francis Fassett, the architect, and the seated Longfellow was the work of Franklin Simmons, who had started out his career as a sculptor in Portland at the time of the Civil War. Um, this is in Longfellow Square. It was dedicated in the late 1880s and is still very much a landmark today. Next, please. Now we're going to take a little journey down Congress Street through these old postcards. We're going from Longfellow Square down toward Congress Square. And of course, the major landmark in this view is the old Portland Public Library, also known as the Baxter Building. This beautiful brownstone and sandstone Romanesque style building based on the facade of a medieval Romanesque church in Italy was Portland's first public library. This was the gift of James P. Baxter, who had made a fortune in the canning business and became very much a scholar and a philanthropist later in life, giving the library building to the city. And the Maine Historical Society was also housed here in the early days before it moved to its present location in 1907. This building was built and dedicated in the late 1880s. Next, please. Now we're in Congress Square, and you can see the electric cars, which came in the mid-1890s. The landmark here is the Libby Building, originally built as a YMCA with shops and offices to help offset the cost of the YMCA as rental properties, then taken over by one of the members of the Libby family. It's a building that was built in 1897, torn down around 1980 for the Portland Museum of Art. And over on the left, you can see the little one-story building at the corner of Congress and Free Streets. That is the original configuration of the H.H. Hay building, to which a second story was added in 1922. Next, please. Now we're on our way down Congress Street, and we can date this Detroit card by the fact that in the background looms that large white building, which is the Fidelity Trust Building, built in 1909, 1910. We'll see it in a few moments in a close-up, but that building was, when it was finished in 1910, the tallest building in New England. By 30 feet, it exceeded the Boston building limit. And Portland and Maine were very proud of that. To the left is Mechanics Hall, built in the late 1850s, the home of the Maine Charitable Mechanics Association. And the rest of these are commercial buildings on both sides, except where you see the great bank of elms spreading out over the street in the center of the view, with the Fidelity building in the background. That's the marker for where the Wadsworth Longfellow House is located. Next, please. Here's a close-up of some of the commercial buildings, Victorian brick commercial buildings of the 1860s and 70s. After the Great Fire, even though what we call the Old Port today, Middle Street and Exchange Street built up very rapidly. As Portland expanded westward, many of the small homes and businesses from Congress Square down to Monument Square were replaced by these larger commercial buildings, and particularly the emergence of department stores in the 1870s and 80s. Next, please. Now we're in Monument Square. And over to the right, we see the Civil War Monument, dedicated in 1891. We'll take a closer look at that in a moment. In the background is the old United States Hotel, later known as Edwards and Walker's, which was a electrical and plumbing supply business. To the left is the Deering Block, which was a theater, the Portland Theater. And to the right, the Clap Block, which was a commercial building. Center right is the dome of the City Hall. Again, we'll be taking a closer look at that in a few minutes. Next, please. This postcard commemorates both of the monuments at either end of the city. To the right, the Longfellow Monument that we've already addressed. And then to the left is a lovely colorized view of the of Memorial Day exercises at the Civil War Monument. From the time of the end of the war, bearing in mind that Portland sent approximately 5,000 of its population of 30,000, about 5,000 men during the 4-year period served in the Civil War in Maine regiments and elsewhere to the war. So there was a great deal of discussion in the community about how those men would be honored, both those who had lost their lives and those who had served. And ultimately, the decision was made to take down the old city hall that was right in the center of Monument Square and create a Civil War monument. The base was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, major American architect who designed the base for the Statue of Liberty. And in fact, this is a slightly scaled down version of the base of the Statue of Liberty. And then on top of it was placed another Franklin Simmons sculpture, one called either the Republic or Our Lady of Victories, a kind of classical goddess who is proclaiming the victory of the Union. Next, please. Now, the old theater, the Deering Theater, was torn down in 1909, and this very handsome, sleek, high-rise building, the Fidelity Trust building, was built in its place, completed in 1910. As I mentioned, at its inception, the tallest building in New England. Of course, that was soon to change, but for a few years it had that distinction. This building, which has for most of its life been an office building, is now going to be converted into residential apartments. Next, please. Now we're looking at a close-up of the old City Hall. This structure stood on the location of the present City Hall. It was originally built in the Italian style in 1858 to 1862. It burned only 4 years after its construction was completed in the Great Fire of 1866. The mass of the building, the walls, the stone front and the brick side walls largely survived the fire. And so the shell of the building was reused to rebuild the building. But the dome was changed. It was a little heavier, more classical dome than had been on the 1858 building. This building, in turn, burned in a fire in January of 1908. Next, please. And was replaced between 1909 and 1912 by the present Portland City Hall. John Calvin Stevens, the architect, really most prominent architect in Portland at the time, was very concerned about the quality of the building that would replace the City Hall that burned, because there was a lot of talk about actually taking those walls and reusing them yet again. But by that time, the building was rather out of style. So he set aside his own involvement, saying, he would not take the commission himself. And instead, Portland should interview two or three of the top architects in the country. And ultimately, Portland chose one of the top firms in New York, Carrere and Hastings, and they built this beautiful North J granite building uh, based on the model of the early 19th century New York City Hall. It's really a very elegant building. But then Stevens was prevailed upon to be the associate architect, to be on the spot in Portland to actually oversee the construction. So he did have some involvement in this building. But more than a century later, still a building that's very much in use, with, of course, the large municipal auditorium, which you see at the far right down on Myrtle Street. Next, please. Now we're looking up Congress Street toward Monument Square. The City Hall is at the right. Beyond it, the tan-colored building is the Masonic Hall, or Masonic Block, built around 1911. And way in the background, you can see the towering Fidelity Building. So this would date this view at about 1912 to 15. Next, please. Uh, Portland in the early 20th century um, was blessed with a number of beautiful uh, classical Beaux-Art public buildings. They included not only the City Hall, but also this is the Cumberland County Courthouse, built between 1905 and 10, designed by the local architect George Burnham with assistance from a major architect in Boston named Guy Lowell. It's a very elegant building. If you go in it today, still some of the vestiges of the interior. And of course, the major courtroom that's used by the Supreme Court and Superior Court is just a grand space. Next, please. Now we're returning to the heart of the commercial area of the city. We're looking from Monument Square down into Middle Street. This is the area that was built very rapidly after the Great Fire of July 4th, 1866. And our primary focal point here is the Falmouth Hotel, built between 1866 and 1868. It was a project of J.B. Brown, who was the wealthiest man in Portland at the time. His commitment to rebuilding the city, he had lost about 14 buildings, was a great influence in helping the city to rebuild again. To the left is an area that became known as the Golden Triangle. These Victorian commercial buildings were all cleared in the 1970s, and one city center is now there on the left. Next, please. Portland was known as the Forest City, and in part because there were beautiful trees on its major streets everywhere. This is State Street, which was laid out in 1801 by a merchant, Joseph Holt Ingraham. And at that time, he planted on either side, he planted double rows of elm trees. And I can remember in my youth in Portland in the 50s and into the early 60s, before the Dutch elm disease came, that these elms had grown to a point 160 years old where they met and created a sort of arch across the street. It was really very beautiful, but they're all gone now. Next, please. Here's another view of State Street looking toward Longfellow Square, again, with the beautiful double rows of elms on either side. Next, please. Now, Portland received its first park right after the Great Fire, Lincoln Park at Franklin and Congress Streets. It was a small park. The purpose was largely to create a fire break in the middle of the city. In case a major fire came again, there might be a way to help stop it with a big open space. It wasn't really until the 1870s that this major park was developed, called Deering Oaks or Deering's Oaks. This was a pond and beautiful forest of oaks that existed between the Deering pasture that ran from Deering Street down to Park Avenue. And then this was the area in between, where now beyond it today is USM, but where USM was the Deering estate. The Deerings were one of the prominent 18th and 19th century families of Portland. They owned vast acreage, including this entire area of Deering's Oaks. In the 1870s, there was a movement afoot to have this particular part of the Deering holdings become a public park. And the Deering family agreed to it on the basis that they would be relieved of 10 years of real estate taxes in return for the gift of the land. And I think that was a pretty good arrangement because it resulted in a great open parkland. Next, please. Here we're looking at the kind of inlet from the large pond. Next, please. And the Victorian fountain. And to the right is what is known as the castle, which was built in the 1890s, a little building for people to retreat to, particularly in the winter. Next, please. Other parks in Portland from the 19th century included the eastern and western promenades. Portland was very far-sighted in the 1830s in realizing that eventually the eastern and western sections of the city would develop residentially. And so under the aegis of Mayor Levi Cutter in the 1830s, the city acquired the right-of-ways along the eastern and western promenades. And gradually the city developed these as carriageways and walking paths and planted them with elms. And this, we see the beautiful elms along the eastern promenade looking out toward Martin's Point in Falmouth in the early 1920s, pardon me, the early 1900s. Next, please. Now, one section of the Eastern Promenade area that had not been acquired by the city until the late 19th century was what we know today as Fort Allen Park. This acquisition occurred about 1890, and it was inspired by the fact that Portland was becoming this great tourist destination. And there was talk of building a big tourist hotel right on this property overlooking the harbor. Of course, it would have been, quite a coup for a hotel to be there, but the citizenry of Portland was very concerned that their ability to have access to the beautiful views of the harbor and the islands would be curtailed. And so consequently, there was a public movement for the city to buy all of this perimeter land on the ocean side of the Eastern Promenade, and then develop a park, public park, where Fort Allen is. Fort Allen had actually been a fortification at the time of the Revolution. That's where it gets its name. Next, please. And here we see an electric trolley going along the Eastern Promenade with Fort Allen in the park in the background. And in the lower right is a bandstand built about 1890 when this area became a public park, a bandstand designed by John Calvin Stevens, and still there, very nicely restored by the city. Next, please. Here's another view from Fort Allen Park, looking directly out into the harbor and looking at the right to Fort Preble and way out to Cushing's Island. And there again, the bandstand at the right. Next, please. Now, at the other end of the city, the western end of the city had, in the 1830s, done the same acquisition of the right-of-way, and then gradually they acquired the land on the non-residential side, which you see on the right of this postcard. And by the early 1900s, this was a Western Promenade Park. Next, please. In 1910, in this park area of the Western Promenade was erected a statue at the left to Speaker of the House, Thomas B. Reed. As I mentioned, he had died in 1902, and he was a national figure, very much respected in Portland and in Maine, and this was a way to memorialize him. In the background is the original building of the Maine General Hospital, still there, but now surrounded by many larger buildings. Next, please. Here is a view from the Western Promenade toward the hospital. It was designed by Francis Fassett, the Portland architect, and built between 1874 and 1893, this original part of it. Next, please. Here's a close-up of it. Classic Victorian building with towers and pinnacles and lots of brick and stonework. Next. Now we consider the impact of the electric trolley. As early as the Civil War period, about 1864, Portland had had a horse railway, which did go out to the suburbs along Forest Avenue. But of course, the horse railway was a fairly slow operation. But then in the 1890s, the electric trolley came, and this was much more rapid. It helped to greatly enhance the development of the suburbs, particularly in the Deering area, in South Portland and Cape Elizabeth. And the terminus of the trolley lines were pleasure parks. The terminus of the Forest Avenue line was the Riverton Park on Presumpscot River, which was just adjacent to Westbrook. And we see the entrance to it, the stone wall and the entrance. It was started in 1895 and continued into the 1920s. Next, please. Here's a view, if you were taking the trolley, of the tracks going up into Riverton Park with the Riverton Casino in the background. Next, please. And here's a view of the Riverton Casino building, originally designed by John Calvin Stevens in 1895 and much enlarged in 1898 by a Boston architect. It was a festive shingle-style building with a sort of classical tower on the top, almost like a little classical belfry. The word casino had a different connotation than it does today, in that a casino meant it was a place not to gamble, but to go and to socialize, and dinners were served here, and people could sit out on the veranda and relax and look at the river or look at the park. Next, please. Here's a view of the Riverton Casino building from the Presumpscot River. Presumpscot River was very popular for recreation, for boating and canoeing. Next, please. And there was an open-air theater in the summer right by the river as part of the park. Here we see a concert being given to the left on the stage and a large audience. Next, please. And here, just a prosaic view of the Presumpscot River, which was popular not only with the boating and canoeists, but also with the artists of the period. Next, please. And there's just another view. Next, please. And one more. Lots of Presumpscot River views. Next, please. Now we return to the Portland Peninsula, or actually just across from it. And this is a wonderful photograph that was created into a Detroit color postcard. These are old wooden schooner vessels that are waiting for repairs in the shipyards of South Portland at the turn of the century. These were still being used into the 1920s along the coast. Next, please. The terminus of the Cape Elizabeth line was a place called Cape Cottage. Originally at Cape Cottage, there had been an early summer hotel. going back to the 1830s and 40s. But when the trolley line created the terminus there, they built a large casino building of similar purpose to the Riverton Casino. This is the beach adjacent to the casino, and to the right you can see the land side of the casino up on the hillside, the little bathhouses below. Next, please. Here is the land side of the Cape Cottage Casino. Really very elegant colonial style building designed by John Calvin Stevens with this lovely park-like setting in the foreground. This is what you would have seen as you entered the park by trolley. Next, please. And here's the ocean side, which is even more elaborate with these great porches for people to sit out and look out across the ocean to Cushing's Island. This building, the core of it, still stands today. If you visually remove those great porches, the core of the building, after it finished its life as a casino in the 1920s, became a residence. And that part of it, with the columns in the front, are still there. Next, please. Here's the view from the Cape Cottage Casino, and the large white structure looming up on Cushing Island was the old Ottawa House Hotel, which burned in 1917. Next, please. I'm sure everyone knows this landmark. This is Portland Headlight, but interestingly, although this card was made in the early 1900s, the Detroit company chose to use an earlier photograph because we're looking at the early, simple little 1.5-story keeper's house that went back well into the 19th century, whereas it was actually gone by the time this postcard was made, but they chose to use the earlier photograph. Next, please. And then another postcard shows us the circa 1890 keeper's house, which is a much larger Queen Anne style structure that is there today. Next, please. Postcards of lighthouses were very popular. People collected them along with other views. This is what we call the Spring Point light of 1897, 98. Initially out in the harbor, but then in the mid-20th century connected to land by a large breakwater. Next, please. And here, the Ram Island light, the last of the lights to be built in Portland Harbor in the early 20th century, large granite pillar. Next, please. In the harbor, Fort Gorges started in 1858, completed during the Civil War. Fort Gorges was part of a plan to fortify Portland Harbor because Portland Harbor was considered a very important place strategically, economically, particularly with the connection of the railroad to Montreal and the goods going to and from England and Europe. And so this fort was constructed. It never fired a shot, but it was part of a defense system that was upgraded at the time of the Civil War that included Fort Scammell and Fort Preble as well. All of this planning, of course, went for naught in the midst of the Civil War when a Confederate raider in the dark of night came into Portland Harbor, seized a U.S. revenue cutter, took it out into the harbor and burned it. So much for trying to defend the harbor. Next, please. Now we're at Peaks Island, which was a very popular resort from the mid 19th century on, and by the early 20th century, as we see at this landing at Peaks Island, 3 big hotels are in view, center left on, and then what is the Gem Theater that started out as a sort of arched, almost like a huge Quonset hut, arched structure that was a roller rink, but then became a summer theater. Next, please. And here's a view at the landing with the island steamer coming in. Next, please. And this is a general view um, looking toward the waterfront of Peaks Island. You can just barely make out the Gem Theater, center right. Next, please. Here's another view of the waterfront of Peaks Island with the Gem Theater at the right and some of the big hotels peering up on the horizon. Next, please. And there's another close-up of the landing with the Gem Theater. Next, please. Here, some of the just the open space on Peaks Island. Next, please. Another Peaks Island view. Looking and then looking from Peaks Island over to Cushing Island with Whitehead at the right. Here, one of the few dated postcards, 1904. Next, please. And here is the steamboat landing at Cushing's Island, which up until 1917 was open to the general public because of the fact that there was a large summer hotel there from the time of the Civil War until the time of World War I, the Ottawa House. And then after the Ottawa House burned, it became much more privatized there as a summer community. This is the little dock house that was designed by Stevens. He was involved in designing many of the cottages on Cushing's Island in the 1880s and 90s, as well as the appurtenant buildings. Next, please. And this is one of the walks on Cushing's Island. Cushing's Island was initially developed as a resort, as I mentioned, with a large brick hotel called the Ottawa House, built at the time of the Civil War. And then the Cushing family who owned the island, they were from Montreal, and they decided in 1883 to consult Frederick Law Olmsted, the leading landscape architect in America, to lay out the island as a summer resort. And so these lovely paths, and of course there were many trees planted, and the locations for the cottages were carefully chosen through a landscape plan. And some of that still survives today. Next, please. Now, at the time of the Spanish-American War, the coastal defenses of Portland Harbor were refortified and upgraded, and this became the emergence of Fort Williams in Cape Elizabeth, and in this case, Fort Leavitt on Cushing's Island in the foreground. These were all our artillery emplacements with the idea of defending the opening of the harbor. Next, please. One of the great physical natural landmarks of Portland Harbor is Whitehead at one end, the north end of Cushing's Island. Next, please. And here in one of our final views, we have this lovely poetic view of Portland Head in the center and the tugboat bringing in the schooner. This really kind of sums up the pleasant, beautiful, both natural and man-made attractions of Portland at the turn of the century. Next. That's it. There.
Great. Well, great, Earle. Thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure. It's fun to do.
Wonderful.
And I think the images are great.
Yeah, really. And yeah, it's really great to see that and sort of try to orient them to present day views and tying them together. Yeah, so if anybody wants to turn on their cameras and ask questions, please do that or put it in the chat box. That would be wonderful.
Sure, happy to do so.
Yeah. Oh, there's Donna. Her phone didn't die. Donna, your sound's not on.
Uh, Donna, you're muted.
I'm in DC
Oh,
on my
good, good, good.
phone.
Now we have you.
Yeah, I'm on DC on my phone. It's going to die any minute, but I loved it. And I had one quick question.
Sure.
Um, uh, Detroit did do a couple of shebig, and one was of a bunch of fish houses. And I've got to go home and look when I get home. But it seems like it's almost the same image that was printed by another company. Was that possible? That different?
Yes. Oh, yes. No. Um, these photographs that were used to make these postcards were traded off among other companies as well, you know. And there's definitely, if you study Detroit and Morris and Layton in particular, there is an occasional overlap. Yeah. Because
Yeah, I
the
was just
the
wondering
the
if that was the case.
yeah, the core of each one of these postcards is an actual photograph, and sometimes a photograph would get sold to more than one company. You know? Yeah.
Okay, that's great. It was great, Earl. A great way to tell history. I
Well,
loved it.
I mean, postcards are just so wonderful. I don't know what we'd do without them. They fill in such an important gap in our visual history, really.
I know we're lucky that people started collecting them a long time ago.
Mm.
My aunt was the secretary for years of the Bay State Postcard Club, and she could buy any postcard she wanted, two for a nickel. So in the beginning,
Oh, I know. You know, when I started out very young, like maybe 10 or 12 years old, probably about 12, I used to go to the Longfellow Antique Shop on Park Avenue. Well, it was in Portland Street actually before Park Avenue started, run by Ruth Boyd, and she specialized in lamps and postcards. And she had hundreds of boxes of postcards, of which any postcard was a nickel at that time, you know.
yeah.
And that's how I started building the collection that's ended up being the state collection, you know.
Well, great job. I'm signing off.
Thank you, Donna. Great to see you.
Great. All righty. Any other questions from those present? Nope. Uh,
Well, oh,
here's Jill. Turn on your mic, Jill.
Thanks, Earl. Once again, great fun. Great tour of Portland with all these pictures. I just, they were printed in color or were they hand colored?
no, they were printed in color. It
They
was
were.
a Swiss printing process that Detroit bought the rights to for America. And they called it commercially, they called it photo tint. You know, which makes sense. But it was the highest of the early 20th century postcards. It was the highest quality process that was available. And so it created this effect that actually many of them do look like almost like paintings, really.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, they're spectacular quality. Boy,
yeah, they're beautiful. Yeah,
thanks.
thank you. Well, I'm very delighted to be with you this evening, and it's appreciate it very much. It's great
Great.
to see you all and to be part of this.
Thanks, Earl. Yeah, it was great to have you back. It's you could give every lecture and
Well, no. Other people
yourself.
should.
Oh
You
yeah,
want to hear from other people.
but it's wonderful.
Right. Thank you.
Speaking of lectures, we do have another one coming up by Thomas Bennett, who's from he's with Casco Bay Archaeology Society, and he's going to talk about titled Subterranean Ancient Clues, Activities in Casco Bay Archaeology 2022 to 24. So that'll be April 22nd at 7 p.m. on Zoom. And that's our next talk coming up.
Great. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
I've met him. So thanks everybody. Thanks
very
for
good.
showing up. Have a great night, and we'll see you next time.
Very good. Thank you.
Night.